this video, I'm going to get into every gory little detail of how to draft and sew these high-waisted pleated pants. The good news is that we don't have to start from scratch. We can just take a basic pant pattern and evolve and morph that ever so slightly into the high-waisted pleated pants we want. Perhaps you already have a basic pants pattern that you want to use. Fantastic. If you don't have one, I've done a whole video just on drafting a basic pattern. Editing corn, share the link. Or a good old-fashioned Google search result will show that there's countless free ones available on the internet. Let's start by just tracing off the front leg panel and the back leg panel. I also copied over my basic structural lines, because it's useful information, but also we'll be referring to a few of them as we make our adjustments. And I've done that both for the back piece and the front as well. Next, we need to decide how high we want these pants to rise. This is a pair of pants I've made with this pattern, and I naturally make them a little bit higher. So in my case, I'm only going to go up, about 1.5 inches. The amount will vary for you depending on your pattern. Starting off with the back piece at the center line here, I'm going to go up my 1.5 inches. I'm going to mark that 1.5 inches in a couple more spots. Draw that new line across. Then from the center line, I'm going to measure exactly how far it goes out in each side. So 5 for me. Bring that up, mark 5, and then do the same thing on the other side. Mark the spot. Pants tend to taper in a little bit. Yours may not, but there's a good chance that they taper in a little bit. So this line isn't going to perfectly match up here. Instead, we're going to line it up with that edge we made there. Just nicely taper that to there. And then the same thing on this side again. Find a place where it matches on the side here, and then taper that up. A little bit of a gap for me there. Nothing really here, but we're basically stretching this up that length and make sure that the width here is the same width there. I'm going to repeat this in the front. So bring up my center line. And this can be any line really, as long as it's perfectly straight up and down. I'm going to measure up my 1.5 inches. Draw that line across. And then once again, measure out. Make my mark. And here too, again, I'm going to taper that line so it matches. Same thing on the outside again. Find a point where it seems like it's a natural curve to come and meet that new point. This is more art than it is science. Okay, boom. Now the fun bit of deciding how we want to do the pleats. Is it going to be 1 pleat, 2 pleats? Are you crazy? You're going to do 3? And how deep do you want the pleats to be? These are all up to you. I'm a slim guy, so I like to keep mine down to 1 and nice and slim. I like my pleat to be about 3/4 inch deep. If we look at a pleat from a top-down perspective, it looks something like that. And so that's the front of the panel that we're seeing. I said I'm going in 3/4 inch, so I go back 3/4 inch, but then I have to go out that same amount, which is why I multiply it by 2. So that technically when it's all sewn, we go from here and then we just continue out again here, which means I added in that extra 1.5 inches of fabric. I also need to decide, do I want the pleat to open up right underneath the waistband, or do I want it to be sewn for a bit and then have the pleat open up? I'm going with option 2 where it sews down for a little bit, but I'll show both. Personally, I'm gonna sew up until this line here that I added and then have the pleat open up. So I'm gonna go out my 1.5 inches and do that up until here. Extend the pants out to the side that amount. Ay, ay, ay. Yo, this stuff is ripping too easy. Draw in that little bit there as well. And then from here, I'm just gonna taper down to match here. So it's again, a nice smooth transition. And then I'm gonna just curve up and around. So it's nice and gradual. And voila, there's my addition for the pleat. Now, if I weren't going to sew down to here, and I just wanted it to open immediately below the waistband, instead of going down that 1.5 inches up to here, I would just start the taper right here and bring that down like that. And if I were doing 2 pleats, I would have gone an additional 1.5 inches, and it would look something like this. Even further out. Let's trim these pieces out and make a sample. Two pieces for the front, 2 for the back, and I've just gone shorts length because really the focus is on getting the fit right at the top. For the back panel, this is our original dart. We keep that, and then we just go a consistent amount for whatever the additional amount is that we added at the top. Why? Well, here's our butt, and it rounds like that, and then that's what that dart handles. But then here we reach the lower back, where we kind of straighten out, and so we want that in equal amount. Something like that. Just press that down. All right, with both of them done, we can have right sides facing each other and do the seam along the back of the butt here. Magic. Press this seam open as well, and just assume that it's safe to say I press after every step. Anytime there's a new seam, press it open. One can never press enough. Moving on to the front pieces, and I'm going to do the pleats first. I'm not too concerned about where I put them. It's more about just testing the size. Make a mark. And I'm doing it based on the front fly area here. Again, about 7. Okay, roughly there. I can take these 2 points, give them a pinch, flip it that way, and then I'm going to measure 3/4 inch. That's the amount I decided for mine. Again here. I said I'm going down about 1.5 inches. Right there. So I'm going to sew from here to here. Or if you're doing just up to the bottom of the waistband, you basically do the seam allowance amount. There we go. I can flip that open, and voila, I have my pleat. If I lay it like this, of course the pleat opens to the inside of the pants. I flip it the other direction, and now the pleat opens to the side of my pants. And then I'm going to run a little stay stitch right along the top here, just to hold this little flap in place. There we go. It is important, of course, that these 2 front pieces mirror each other. Take the one, flip it over, and then from about somewhere here, I'm going to stitch down and close that up. And it's important to leave the top bit open, because of course we need to be able to slide these pants on to try. Voila. Press this open as well. I even pressed the bits that haven't been sewn because this way I've removed the seam allowance, and when I try them on, it'll be a more accurate fit. Finally, I can stitch these two front panels onto the back panels. Okay, let me go ahead and stitch this together. Time to try these on. You know what? Not bad, not bad. Overall, I think I'm happy with how that is. I might end up just sewing a little tighter in the back here. It's a good chance you may need to make some modifications, some edits. If you found that your sample was a little snug in the front here, you can simply bring this line out just a little bit, as much as you need, and then taper that straight down to meet here. Or alternatively, if it's a little loose, you can just bring that line in a little bit. And there we go, like that. If it's quite a bit that you need to do, then you're going to do it on both sides. In the back, again, if you need to make just ever so slight modifications, you can adjust how much you sew the dart, either in or out a little bit. If you want to adjust a little bit more, then this line along the bum here, again, you can bring in or out as needed, and then tapering it to meet nicely here for a nice curve. I suggest playing around on this stage. It's okay to make a whole bunch of samples until you get them just how you want, and then move on to the next thing. I'm going to overlay my front panel onto another piece of paper, trace the top, and along the inside up until about where the curve starts. I'm going to add an inch or two extra. I always like to have more than not enough. And then I'm going to measure in 2.5 inches in a few spots. Draw that line in as well. Finally add a little curve at the bottom. There we go. For the fly guard on the other side, I'm going to flip the front panel over so it faces in the opposite direction. Trace the top, trace the side, add a few inches again. This time I'm only going to go 2.25 because I need slightly less seam allowance for the zipper on this side. And now I need the line at the bottom here to be perpendicular with the top. So let me just measure down to, say, 11. Draw that in. Fold on this line here. And trim. All right. Voila. My fly guard piece. And then the backing facing of the fly front. All right. It's time to start making the real pair of pants with the good fabric. The 4 leg panels, which you'll notice they mirror each other, and fly pieces with the fabric and interfacing, which I'm going to go ahead and press on real quick. With this fly guard, I'm going to go ahead and just fold it as well. We also need to finish all the raw edges to prevent the fabric from fraying. And if you don't have a fancy serger like me, you can do it with a regular machine. Editing Corn, can you share a link in the description? I won't be showing it every time, but I will continue to be finishing raw edges as I go along, especially the ones that are exposed in the end. So I've got my 2 front panels with right sides facing each other, and I lay my zipper on top, aligning it with the top and the edge. At the bottom, halfway between this nib and the end, I put a pin as a marker. And from that pin, sew down to here. Boom. Now it's time to put on that facing bit. Peel back this right leg panel, and then I take my facing bit and I align it with the edge and hanging over about, half an inch at the bottom. I stitch that on. There's two little details I want to highlight though, so let me just flip that over. Not only have I left a little gap here, I've also stitched just a touch further in by the facing bit, because eventually it'll help this join area here sit nice and flat. I flip this facing piece over and press it to lie nice and flat, and then run a top stitch all the way along from top to bottom. On the opposite leg, on the right side, I take my zipper, I face it down and I align it with the edge and the top. Then it's time for the fly guard, and this is the folded edge. It points inwards, and I align this with the bottom of the zipper and stitch the 3 layers together right on the edge. Now the trick I find is to undo the zipper halfway. So for about, 2 inches, flip up the top 2 layers and move the zipper all the way to the top. Put the pressure foot back down and finish sewing. And that stitch should be halfway between the edge here and that seam with the other panel. Otherwise, in the end, the zipper is going to show through, and that's no good. Now let's press this nice and flat, and then we're going to run a top stitch right along the edge. There we go. Next, we're attaching the facing onto the other side of the zipper. So first, simply flap over that leg panel, and we want to make sure that the zipper's nicely concealed so it doesn't show. I like to hold everything in place with one hand, lift up that leg panel again, hold the facing, and then finally back to the other hand, lift up, find that zipper, and then pin from underneath and facing downwards. Repeat a second time at the bottom. Finally, I flip it back one more time just to make sure everything's lying nice and flat, and indeed, nice. And now I just go ahead and stitch it on. And the reason for that very specific pin direction earlier is it makes it so much easier to remove them. With the needle down, press your foot up, and once again, lift up and move my zipper to the back, put the presser foot back down, and then I can finish sewing this thing on. From here, we can now sew this facing onto the leg panel. I like to feel for the edge just to know where it is. And then I give myself little markings so that it'll be nice and consistent in size. On the underside, I flip up that guard and pin it so that I don't accidentally sew it down as well. Undo the pin and lie the fly guard back down and just sew a little zigzag stitch right here to connect the two. And boom, there we go. Put another one right here to reinforce the tension that happens here. I also like to run a top stitch all the way down to the bottom to reinforce this area. With everything lying nice and flat, I clip off the excess. All right, let's move on to the back of the pants. In terms of pattern pieces, this is the pants fabric, 4 of them, and they're all 8 inches by 4 inches. 6 pieces of interfacing, also 8 inches by 4 inches. 2 pieces of the lining fabric, 8 inches wide as well by 11 inches long. Moving on to the back and putting in this dart, just like we did on the sample. There we go. I want these welt pockets to sit where they normally do on regular pants. In my case, I usually go down 3 inches, but of course I added that 1.5 inches at the top, so mine are going to go down 4.5 inches. 4.5, little marking, roughly there. That's my center right here. And I want the final pocket to be 6 inches wide. So I'm going to go out 3 in either direction. Right there. Got a piece of interfacing, fold it in half. I line it up, open that up, which I can now press down into place. And while I'm here, I can press the remaining 4 interfacing bits onto the wrong side of the fabric bits. The reason I use this interfacing everywhere is it just adds structure so that we're going to get a really nice, clean, crisp finish. I find it tends to soften up after a few washes, or we can also just tear off the extra bits when we're done. I use that same technique again to find my centers, and then I lay these 2 pieces, one at the bottom and one at the top. First, I copy over my vertical lines on each side, and then measuring out from the middle, I make my 2 horizontal lines, the distance between the 2 being the final height I want my final welt to be. And then I run 2 stitches parallel to each other from this edge to that edge. From here we want to cut this line down the middle and then go in a V shape to either end. And we want to get as close as possible to the edge of these seams without actually snipping them, because if we do, things are going to unravel and we'll have round corners in the end. I personally like to cut from this other side, because that way I can hold these 2 pieces of fabric out of the way and I don't accidentally cut them as well. Like that. Let's flip this bottom one through to the other side. Press that open just a little bit, like so. Using the iron as well to make sure it sits as flat as possible. And I've continued this fold all the way out to the edge at a nice consistent width. Press out these V's as well. And then I roll this flap up until it sits nice and flat just below that top seam there. I flip it over and then I can run a stitch right underneath, right up against the edge to hold that in place from one side to the other. Just like that. Next, the buttonhole. Every machine does buttonholes slightly different, so check your manual if you're unsure. Or Editing Corn, if you'd be so kind and share a link to a video you think is useful. Now I'm going to flip this top piece through to the other side. Push it to sit nice and flat. Flip it over and give that a pressing along the top as well. I pick up where I left off. I go up the side, along the top, down the side again, and finish off in the corner there. And then finally some zigzag stitches on the ends just to reinforce everything a little bit. There we go. The final element is the lining. So I lift up this top flap. I take my lining and align it along the bottom here, and I'm going to attach it all the way along. Press that to lay nice and flat, and then take the other end and attach it along there. Final step is to close up these edges. And if you don't have a serger, you're going to want to take your scissors and just trim the end so that it's all a nice clean edge to sew. Now connect these two panels, right sides facing each other, and just sew all the way through the butt here. And I tend to do a double stitch here. I find there's just more stress over time, and this way there's less likely to be rips. And once more, I press. One can never press enough. It's the secret to clean finishes. Moving on to the front pockets. I've got my leg pattern here, and first I'm going to copy over my seat line and then that center line. I then temporarily fold in my pleat, pin it in place just for now. I'm going to realign it on top based on those earlier markings. And no, it will not be sitting perfectly flat, but that is okay. Now I trace along the top and down the side. And the reason for these is so that we can now square up this edge nicely. I've also pinned the pants, and so I'm going to measure at the top here. And I think I want to go in about 7 inches. So I measure in 7 inches. And so then measuring from that center line to the mark I just made. So I'm just going to copy that down in a few places. Once again, I measure from the edge, and I want my pocket to go down, 11.5 inches. So I do the same thing here, measure down 11.5. Measure from this line down to the mark I just made, which is 2 3/4. Copy that over. Now we're going to do this piece here that covers the lining. I traced out another copy of the lining. Here we go. The bottom I'm going to mark 2 inches, and at the top I'm going to go in 4 inches. I've folded my lining fabric in half, and then I lay the pocket piece on top, aligning the long straight edge with the fold. And with my pants fabric, I cut out that other covering bit. Of course, I need 2 of each, and most importantly, notice how they both reflect each other. I'm going to finish the raw edges just on this inside angle and along the bottom. Right, turns out we didn't need to do the bottom, but that's okay. I've aligned this piece with the edge of the lining, and then I'm going to sew from the top down to the bottom here. Next, I finish the raw edges all the way around, and that should attach the remaining sides. And I've placed my pocket lining where it's ultimately going to end up. So I'm going to take that out, and then I'm going to flip it over and lay it on top of the leg panel. I'm going to mark in about 1.5 inches at the top by the waistband. And then along the side, I'm going to mark down about 8 inches. I can stitch right along there. I trim off the excess, press down that seam to open it up, and press one more time. It's a small detail, but I like to have ever so slight of a lip just so that the pocket lining doesn't show through. Now I run a top stitch along the pocket opening here just to hold these 2 layers together. I can now flip over the lining and sew this bottom edge. I have everything laying flat here. At the top I measure to make sure I still got that 1.5 inches. I'm going to do a couple short stay stitches on both ends of the openings just to hold everything in place. Need help with your project? Want to chat with other like-minded people? Yeah? Well, just head over to my Patreon. It's a nice little collective of us developing over there that do this on a daily basis. All right, we can now move on to that front pleat. And I'm going to measure out from the edge of the zipper to the end here. So for me, that's about 11. And usually the pleat starts about 3/5 of the way out, or about 60%. So in my case, that's 6.5. I'm going to put a mark here. And I'm going to go down, again, starting from the zipper. Again, mark 6.5. Grab both of these points, pinch them, and fold over without the pocket caught in there, of course. I'm feeling for the edges here and making sure it's 3/4 of an inch. Okay, good. I had said I was going to go down 1.5 inches with my sewing before the pleat opens up. So right up to about there. Pin and hold this in place. I'm going to repeat on the other side, again using my fly as my center line. There we go. I also pinned along the sides and in the middle because it's time to try these on. The goal here is to make sure that they fit well, which I'm happy about, but to also check these lines here for our pleats. And we want this line at the top to be aligned with the hip bones here and then shoot straight down. So in my case, I need to bring everything in just a touch to about here. There we go. I think I'm happy with that. I think that looks good. I like to, at this point, press in my center crease. I undo this pin here so it's loose and then repin it to itself like that. The bottom hem, I fold the pant leg in half and then grabbing both pins, I fold in half so I have my nice straight line down the middle. How far down you go is entirely up to you. Maybe you want to crease just the pleat. I personally like to go all the way down to the bottom of the pant leg. I'm going to pull out this pin here at the top, flip the pants over. From this crease, I measure out my 3/4 of an inch. Good, and then I measure down 1.5 inches. Just going to put a little mark right there. In that crease, I'm going to sew from the top down to my marking, and I'm going to make sure not to sew in the pocket. Finally, I like to do a stay stitch right along the top here to just connect this leg panel onto the pocket. Now it's finally time to put these two panels together. All right, they're really starting to look like pants. Moving on to the waistband, and on the inside it's just going to be one long strip of fabric. On the outside, it's going to be one piece in the back, two chunks on the side where the side tabs are and all the bits that go with that, and then finally the two pieces to finish off the front. I want a full measurement of all the way around, so I'm going to start by one part of the fly and just walk around the outside. Okay. Next, I want the measurement from one side seam to the other side seam along the back here. Hope you're writing yours down as well too. I also want the measurements in the front from the side seam to the end of the fly, and same thing on the other side from the side seam all the way to the end of the fly guard. First, I'm going to do the big long piece, and for me that was 37 up to here. And then I always like to have extra to play with, so I'm going to add 2 inches on either side for a total of 4. So for me, that means I'm going to 41. I like my waistband to be 1 3/4 inches in height. You choose what you want. I also like 1/2 inch of seam allowance on either side. So for me, the total on that is 2 3/4 inches. I want these tabs on the side to be 4 inches. And in order to center them, I need to take 2 off the front and 2 off the back. I'm going to make the back panel first, which means I take off 2 here and 2 here for a total of 4. My back panel was 16. I take off the 4, which brings me to 12, but then I need seam allowance, 1/2 inch of each, which brings me back to 13. One of my pieces for the front was 9 inches. I go back 2 inches to account for the side tab, but then if you recall, I added 2 inches on either side for that long strip on the inside. So I go back that 2 inches again, plus my seam allowance on one side brings me to 9.5. My front piece on the other side is 12, so I'm simply going to make that 12.5. Same math applies. Finally, we need the pattern piece for the side tab there, and I said that was going to be 4 inches. Seam allowance on both sides means it's going to be 5. The final pattern pieces we need is this bit and then the little piece here that holds the loop. So based on my math, I need this to be about 7 inches once it's all done. So seam allowance means it's 8 inches. The reason being is because it has to loop through here and then back again, and we still want to have enough to be able to pull on it a little bit. As for this piece, we want it to be about 3 inches because it folds back on itself to hold this piece. This is the hardware I'm going to use, so I need the pulley bits to be about 1 inch. So 8 inches plus another 1, 2, 3 right there. Now as for the height, I said I wanted them 1 inches, so if I double it up, that's 2, plus seam allowance for each piece, that's another inch, brings me to 3. So these are all my pieces. I did 1 of everything, 2 of everything though for the 3 side tabby bits. And then 2 pieces of interfacing, the full length. I'm going to fold these longer pieces in half, sew down one side and then along the bottom to close it up. And then with the shorter ones, fold again and just sew right along the bottom. Voila, there we go. I've also trimmed off the excess seam allowance. Next, flip these puppies inside out and make it look easy. This is the piece that goes along the back. I then take one of these long bits and align the 2 raw edges. Those short side tab pieces, right sides facing each other. And then I'm simply going to sew along here. I'm going to repeat on the other side, but mirrored of course. I'm going to flip the top layer and the stringy bit over, making sure my seam allowance faces inwards. All right. And then top stitch along here to hold it all together. There we go, starting to take shape. I now take this shorter piece and loop it around that middle bar, fold it in half, and I'm going to lay it down in the middle here on the other side, and then finally I lay it right sides facing each other, the last bit that goes around to the front. Now if you noticed, I've labeled mine FG, front guard, because if you recall, the 2 pieces for the front are different sides, so make sure to put the right one on the right side. And then I mirror that, of course, again on the other side. Here too, sew down, press, and top stitch. So ultimately, the way they work is they go underneath and over, loop back around through where they started, and voila. Kind of cool. Next up, I'm putting the interfacing onto the waistband pieces. And I've put down a towel to help absorb the bulkiness of the hardware. There we go. Line these two pieces up together. And then I'm going to sew just along the top here. On the outside of the waistband with all the hardware, I go ahead and find my center, and I align it with the center seam at the back of my pants. Pin that in place. Right sides are facing each other. Of course, stitch it all the way around in both directions. Now it's time to deal with the edges here. So I've got the full thing folded down. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to take my fly, I'm going to fold it at a 45-degree angle so it sits just above that seam we did in the previous step. Pin to hold it in place. I'm going to fold over this top chunk here as well. Pin that down. Essentially, I want all the fabric in between this seam here and the top one. Now I can fold this piece over and try to get it to lay as flat as possible. Pin that as well. And then flip it over. That's the top of my waistband there. I can feel for that 45-degree angle. I look for the point, which is right about here. Draw myself a line that I'm going to sew along. And then I'm essentially just going to sew from here, straight down, and then in about an inch, inch and a half this way. There we go. Like that. I trim off the excess. Trim my edges. Pull out all the various different pins. And then I just start pulling everything out. And what that does is essentially close up the edge here, give us some decent edges. To finish the waistband, I push this seam into the waistband, give it a pressing to sit nice and flat. And then I take the loose side and I fold it over, and I want the folded edge to align with that seam right there. All right, pin and hold, move along. Now I just top stitch this down into place. Along the edge as well, and then back along the top. Voila, there we go. Put on my buttonhole. All right, the hard work is done. We're down to the little details. I've double rolled the hem in a quick try on just to make sure I got it right. All right. I like to put little bar tacks in areas that get pressure, like the bottom of the pocket here, the end of the pleat here as well. For the back crease, I find the buttonhole of the back pocket, give that a pinch. I find the center along the bottom hem and get that all nice and flat. And then that is my back crease. Again, this crease is entirely optional. I just like the look of it. Next, the buttons. Stitch these puppies in place. The buttons by the back welt pockets as well. And we're done. Thank you to these very generous people for their monthly support over on Patreon and in general. If you're interested, you like what I do, check out the various links in the description. I'm up to all kinds of things. Okay, let's try them on.